At my wedding, I saw my sister pour something into my champagne when no one was looking. I swapped our glasses. When she raised the toast, I smiled. Then it began. Most people would call what happened next a tragedy. They would look at the wreckage of the reception hall, the shattered crystal, and the ruined dress, and they would see a disaster. But from where I sat, at the center of the head table with my hand resting, lightly in the warm grip of my new husband, it looked like justice. It looked like the final, violent correction of a balance sheet that had been in the red for 29 years. The centerpiece of the destruction, or rather the target of it, stood at the far end of the ballroom. It was a masterpiece of confectionery, architecture that had cost me more than a used sedan. The wedding cake. It was 6 tiers of red velvet perfection, towering over the guests like a sugared obelisk. Each layer was wrapped in ivory fondant, so smooth it looked like porcelain, decorated with edible gold leaf that caught the light of the chandeliers like scattered stars. I handmade sugar peonies and gardenias, cascaded down one side in a breathtaking display of the baker's artistry. The bill had come to $8,500. My mother had wept when she saw the invoice, clutching her chest in a performance of financial martyrdom that ignored the fact that I was paying for it myself. My sister, Bianca, had just rolled her eyes and made a snide comment about trying too hard to impress the in-laws. But looking at it now, standing pristine and proud, under the warm glow of the ballroom lights, I knew it was worth every single penny. Not for the taste, and certainly not for the aesthetic. It was worth it, because it was about to become the most expensive landing pad in the history of Charleston society. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted lamb. 200 guests filled the round tables, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns that shimmered in the candlelight. This was the world I had fought to enter. This was the sanctuary of order and prestige that I had carefully curated to insulate myself from the case of my upbringing. My husband, Julian, sat to my left. He was devastatingly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his presence radiating the easy confidence of a man whose ancestors had buildings named after them. To my right sat Bianca. My sister was poured into a champagne-colored silk gown that probably cost more than her entire net worth. She had demanded to be the maid of honor, of course. She had wept and wheedled, and threatened until our parents had forced my hand, claiming that excluding her would break the family apart. So there she sat, looking for all the world like the supportive sibling. She was laughing at something the best man said, throwing her head back to expose the long line of her throat. Her hand resting casually near the stem of her wine glass. If you looked closely, you could see the tremors of excitement in her fingers. She was vibrating with it. She thought she had won. She thought that in a few minutes, the drug she had slipped into my glass would take hold. She imagined I would start slurring my words during the speeches. She pictured me stumbling, perhaps knocking over a centerpiece, humiliating myself in front of Julian's wealthy, judgmental family. She wanted to see the perfect marketing director, the woman who prided herself on logic and self-possession, reduced to a sloppy, drunken mess. She wanted to prove to everyone that no matter how far I climbed, I was still just trash wrapped in silk. I took a sip from my glass. The liquid was cool and crisp, tasting of apples and brioche. It was an excellent vintage, provided by Julian's grandfather from a cellar that was older than the United States Constitution. It was also completely clean. I watched Bianca out of the corner of my eye. She raised her own glass to her lips, the crystal catching the light. She drank deeply. I suppressed a smile. She had no idea that the colorless, odorless sedative she had intended for me was currently sliding down her own throat. She had no idea that the melatonin and muscle relaxants were already dissolving into her bloodstream, beginning their slow, heavy work on her central nervous system. The jazz quartet in the corner began to play a soft, wandering melody. The servers moved efficiently between the tables, clearing plates with the quiet professionalism that only exorbitant service fees could buy. Everything was perfect. The lighting was flattering, casting a golden haze over the room. The floral arrangements were symmetrical. The timeline was running exactly to the minute. I had spent months planning this night, agonizing over every detail, every angle, every potential point of failure. I had built a fortress of perfection to keep the monsters out. But the monster was already inside. She was sitting right next to me, wiping a smudge of lipstick from the rim of her glass. I felt a squeeze on my hand and turned to look at Julian. He offered me a small, private smile, the kind that made the noise of the room fade away. He thought my tension was just nerves. He thought I was worried about the catering, or the music, or whether his great-aunt approved of the centerpieces. He had no idea that I was counting down the seconds until a body hit the floor. I squeezed his hand back, anchoring myself. I was done being the victim. I was done being the peacekeeper. For years, I had let my parents and my sister mine my life for their own comfort. I had let them take my money, my joy, and my peace of mind, all in the name of family loyalty. But tonight, the ledger was closing. Bianca stifled a small yawn behind her manicured hand. It was starting to understand why I felt no guilt. To understand why the prospect of my sister face, planting into an $8,500 cake, filled me with a sense of profound calm. You have to understand the history of violence that brought us here. It was not a violence of fists and bruises, but a violence of the spirit. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition that had started 3 months ago, in the quiet safety of my apartment, when a knock on the doors signaled the end of my peace. 3 months before the wedding, my life was a spreadsheet of perfectly balanced equations. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a rainy Saturday morning, a mug of Earl Grey steaming beside my laptop. The silence of my apartment was a luxury I had paid for with years of 70-hour work weeks. I was reviewing vendor contracts, highlighting clauses in yellow, feeling the deep, satisfying hum of control. Then, the buzzer rang. I was not expecting anyone. Julian was at the hospital for grand rounds, and I had specifically cleared my calendar to deal with the florists. When I checked the camera feed, my stomach dropped. It was Bianca. She was not alone. She was standing in the lobby, checking her reflection in the glass door while tapping furiously on her phone. I buzzed her up. Not because I wanted to, but because leaving her in the lobby would eventually lead to a scene, and scenes were the one thing I was trying to edit out of my life. She walked into my apartment without a hello, bringing with her a gust of rain and expensive perfume. Cray. She was wearing a pair of yoga pants that I knew retailed for $200 and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. It was a fake, of course, or bought on credit she was currently defaulting on, but Bianca never let reality get in the way of her aesthetic. I have been thinking, she announced, dropping her bag onto my pristine quartz countertop. I closed my laptop. About what, Bianca? She walked over to the fridge, opened it, and frowned at the rows of sparkling water and meal-prepped containers. She wanted a soda. She wanted sugar. She slammed the door shut and turned to me, crossing her arms. About the wedding, she said. I should be your maid of honor. I kept my face neutral, a skill I had perfected in corporate boardrooms. Bianca, I already asked Elena. You know that. Elena was my college roommate, a criminal defense attorney who wore suits that fit like armor and had a gaze that could peel paint. She was my rock. Bianca, on the other hand, was the sand that kept shifting beneath my feet. Bianca wrinkled her nose, as if I had just offered her a plate of spoiled fish. Elena? Really? She is so intense, Vivian, and honestly, a little drab. This is a wedding with old money elements. Do you really want someone who wears gray pantsuits standing next to you in photos that will be in the society pages? I took a slow breath. Elena is my best friend. She has been there for me through everything. And I am your sister, Bianca countered. Her voice took on that familiar, whining edge, a tone that had been drilled into my psyche since childhood. Your only sister. Think about the optics, Viv. What will people think if your own flesh and blood is not your maid of honor? It will look like we are estranged. It will look messy. Julian's family hates messy, right? She had found the chink in the armor. She knew my deepest insecurity was not belonging, was being exposed as a fraud in Julian's world of heritage and effortless grace. She knew I was terrified of bringing my chaotic, lower, middle, class baggage into the pristine hallway of his life. It is not about optics, I said, though my voice lacked the conviction it had 10 seconds ago. It is about who I want by my side. Bianca's eyes narrowed. She pulled out her phone. I am going to call Mom. She will be devastated that you are excluding me. I should have thrown her out right then. I should have pointed to the door and told her that my wedding was not a content creation opportunity for her 12,000 followers, half of whom were bots. But I hesitated, and in that hesitation, I lost. 2 hours later, my parents were sitting on my beige linen sofa. My mother, Blythe, was already dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. My father, Conrad, wore his signature expression of wary disappointment, the one he had perfected over decades of making me feel guilty for existing. Vivian, sweetheart, my mother said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Bianca is devastated. Absolutely devastated. She feels like you do not love her. I sat in the armchair opposite them, feeling like a defendant in a kangaroo court. I never said that. I just have a very close relationship with Elena, and Your sister is going to be family forever, my father interrupted. His voice was a heavy gavel. Friends come and go, but blood is what matters. You know how sensitive Bianca is. You know she has been struggling lately. Struggling. That was their favorite euphemism. Bianca was not struggling. She was drowning in $1,000 of credit card debt that she was hiding from them. She was unemployed, calling herself an influencer, while living off the allowance they could barely afford to give her. But in the mythology of our family, Bianca was the fragile bird with the broken wing, and I was the sturdy branch whose only purpose was to support her. 10 years ago, I had won a full academic grant to a university in Boston. It was my ticket out. 2 weeks before I was set to leave, Bianca had crashed her car into a neighbor's fence while intoxicated. The legal fees and the settlement required immediate cash. My parents had looked at me, then at my college savings, and asked me to do the right thing. They asked me to stay at the local state college and sign over my fund to save my sister's record. I did it. I stayed. I fixed it. And I had been fixing it ever since. Just indulge her, Vivian, my mother pleaded, leaning forward. Do not make her sad. It is one day. Surely you can be generous for one day. The trap snapped shut. If I said no, I was the cruel, selfish sister who cared more about a friend than her own blood. If I said yes, I invited chaos into the most important day of my life. I looked at Bianca, who was scrolling through Instagram on her phone, looking bored now that her champions were fighting for her. Fine, I said. The word tasted like ash. You can be the maid of honor. Bianca looked up, beaming. She clapped her hands, the picture of delight. Oh, Viv, thank you. This is going to be so good for my brand. I can tag the hotel. I can tag the designers. I might even gain a few thousand followers if Julian's mom reposts my stories. My parents nodded approvingly. Good girl, my father's look said. You fixed it. I called Elena later that night to break the news. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Are you sure about this, Viv? She asked, her voice low. No. I admitted, staring out the window at the rain, slicked city streets. But it is easier than fighting them all. Easier is not always better, she warned. She was right. Of course. But I had already made my first mistake. I had nodded in agreement. I did not know then that this concession had paved the way for Bianca's most vicious plot. I thought I was buying peace. In reality, I was financing my own execution. 2 weeks before the wedding, the bill for my surrender arrived via text message. I was in a strategy meeting with my marketing team, presenting the third quarter projections, when my phone buzzed against the mahogany conference table. It was a single, demanding vibration that cut through my focus like a discordant note. I glanced down. It was Bianca. The text read, "Need you to pay for the bridesmaid dress. I am a little short this month." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the physical manifestation of the invisible leash my sister held. I typed back under the table. "How much?" The response came with a photo of a receipt. $1,800. My breath hitched. We had discussed budgets. I had sent her links to elegant, appropriate gowns in the $300 range. I had offered to cover those costs fully. But the receipt on my screen was from a boutique in the French Quarter that served champagne during fittings and required an appointment 2 months in advance. The dress was silk, floor length, and designer. I excused myself from the meeting and walked into the hallway, my heels clicking sharply on the tile. I dialed her number. "Bianca," I hissed into the phone, keeping my voice low. We agreed on the slate blue chiffon. "This is almost $2,000. I could hear the shrug in her voice. "The chiffon looked cheap, Viv." It scratched. "Besides, you are marrying into old money. We cannot look like the poor relations in the photos. What would Julian's mother think if your maid of honor looked like she bought her dress at a department store?" She was weaponizing my own anxiety. She knew that my greatest fear was being exposed as an imposter in Julian's world. She knew that I was terrified of his mother, Eleanor. Looking at my family and seeing something tacky, something grasping. Bianca was betting that I would pay a premium to avoid that judgment. She was right. I did not have the energy to fight. I did not have the energy to explain that Eleanor valued frugality and hated ostentation. I just wanted the problem to go away. I opened my banking app and transferred the money. $1,800. It was not a gift. It was an extortion fee. It was the cost of doing business with a terrorist who shared my DNA. "Got it?" Bianca said cheerfully. "Thanks, sis. Love you." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in the hallway, staring at my reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. I looked put together. I looked successful. But inside, I was already calculating how many overtime hours I would need to work to replenish my savings. By the morning of the wedding, the price of peace had risen even higher. The sun had risen over Charleston with a humidity that promised a storm, but inside the bridal suite, the air conditioning was blasting. I sat at a small vanity table. Not looking at my hair or makeup, but staring at the seating chart I had printed out on cardstock. This was my battlefield map. I had spent hours agonizing over the geometry of the head table. As a marketing director, I understood the power of optics. I understood that where you placed a person dictated how they were perceived. I had placed Julian to my left. This was strategic. It meant that in candid photos taken from the front, my face would be angled toward him, showcasing my good side. It meant that when I turned to speak to him, my body language would be open to the room. To my right, I had placed Bianca. Most brides place their maid of honor next to them out of affection. Placed Bianca there for surveillance. I needed her within arm's reach. I needed to be able to kick her under the table if she started talking about her credit card debt or her latest failed business venture. I needed to control the blast radius. The door to the suite opened, and Alina walked in. My college roommate and best friend looked sharp in her charcoal dress. a stark contrast to the pastel explosion of the bridal suit. She was carrying 2 coffees and a look of deep concern. She set the coffee down and looked at the seating chart. "You are putting her right next to you." "I have to," I said, tracing the name on the card. "If she is next to me, I can manage her. If she is at a guest table, she is a loose cannon." Elena took a sip of her black coffee, her eyes scanning my face. "You look like you are preparing for a deposition, not a wedding." "I feel like I am preparing for a war," I admitted. Elena pulled up a chair and sat close to me. Her voice dropped, losing its usual cynical edge. "Vivian, you need to listen to me. I saw her downstairs. She is manic. She has been ordering room service on your account and telling the staff she is the reason this wedding is happening." I rubbed my temples. "That is just Bianca being Bianca. She needs to feel important." "It is more than that," Elena said. "She hates that you won. She hates that you are marrying a doctor with a trust fund and a kindness that she will never understand. People like Bianca do not just get jealous, Viv. They get destructive. She is going to try something today." I looked at the chart again. The perfectly arranged circles. The carefully chosen fonts. "I have it under control," I said, trying to convince myself. "I paid for the dress. I gave her the title. I let her invite her photographer friend. She got what she wanted. Why would she ruin it?" "Because you are happy," Elena said simply. "And she is not." I dismissed the warning. I told myself that Elena was just being a lawyer, seeing worst-case scenarios where there were none. I told myself that Bianca was selfish, yes, but not malicious. Not on a scale that would matter. I was so focused on the seating chart, on the logic of the arrangement, on the geometry of the table, that I missed the obvious variable. I thought I could manage Bianca by keeping her close. I did not realize that by placing her at my right hand, I was putting myself exactly within striking distance. I finished my coffee, stood up, and smoothed the silk of my robe. "It is time to get dressed," I said. Elena stood too, but she did not look reassured. She looked like she was watching a friend walk into a burning building, armed only with a bottle of water. "Be careful, Viv," she whispered. I nodded, but I was already mentally moving on to the next task. The hair, the makeup, the dress, the performance. I had a role to play, and I was going to play it perfectly. I was going to be the perfect bride, the perfect sister, the perfect daughter. I was going to smile until my face ached. I was going to get through this day, even if it cost me everything I had left. I just didn't know yet that the price was about to go up. The reception dinner was a masterclass in tension disguised as elegance. The ballroom of the Charleston Historic Hotel was awash in the glow of hundreds of beeswax candles, their flames reflecting off the hardwood floors and the crystal chandeliers overhead. At the head table, I sat rigid in my chair, my spine not touching the backrest, forcing a smile that felt like it was carved from marble. The main course had just been cleared. Plates of herb, crusted lamb, and roasted root vegetables were being whisked away by the army of servers who moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts. The air hummed with the polite murmur of conversation, punctuated by the delicate clink of silver against china. To an outsider, it was a perfect tableau of Southern grace. To me, it felt like sitting inside a pressure cooker. I was acutely aware of every set of eyes in the room, particularly the heavy, appraising gazes of Julian's extended family. They were the kind of people who could spot a polyester blend from across a crowded room and who considered loud laughter a moral failing. I had spent the last 2 years auditioning for their approval, smoothing out the rough edges of my personality, moderating my accent, and curating a wardrobe of neutral tones and natural fibers. Tonight was the final exam. Julian leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. His hand found mine under the table, his thumb tracing a soothing circle on my palm. "You are doing great," he whispered. "I think even Aunt Miriam is impressed. And she hates everything." I turned to him, letting genuine warmth flood my expression. This was part of the choreography. The loving gaze. The shared secret. "Look at Uncle Richard," Julian murmured, nodding discreetly toward the bar area. "I think he is trying to flirt with the harpist." I laughed, a soft, melodious sound I had practiced, and turned my body completely to the left to follow his gaze. It was a harmless moment. A husband sharing a joke with his wife. A brief respite from the performance. But in the geometry of the head table, turning left meant turning my back on the right. It meant turning my blind side to Bianca. In my peripheral vision, I caught a flicker of movement. It was smooth, practiced, and so subtle that if I had not spent a lifetime tracking my sister's moods like a meteorologist tracking a hurricane, I would have missed it entirely. Bianca's hand glided across the tablecloth. It looked like an innocent gesture, perhaps reaching for a napkin or adjusting a fork. But her hand did not stop at the cutlery. It hovered over my champagne flute. The crystal caught the candlelight, the bubbles rising in perfect, golden streams. Then, I saw the glint. A tiny glass vial, no larger than a tube of lipstick, was palmed in her hand. With a quick, precise tilt, a clear liquid fell into my glass. It vanished instantly into the effervescence, leaving no trace, no cloudiness, no sign that the vintage champagne had just been weaponized. She pulled her hand back quickly, picking up her own glass and taking a sip, her eyes scanning the room to ensure she had not been observed. She looked satisfied. Smug. My phone, lying face up on the table next to my poison glass, buzzed. The sound was faint, lost under the swell of conversation, but I felt it vibrate against the tablecloth. The screen lit up with a single notification. I looked down. It was from Elena. She was sitting at the VIP table directly across from us, positioned with the clear line of sight of a sniper. The message was 5 words long. Swap glasses. She drugged it. My heart stopped. It did not flutter or skip, it simply seized in my chest, a cold, hard knot of terror. The noise of the ballroom, the laughter, the jazz, the clinking glass, seemed to warp and distort, sounding like it was coming from underwater. I stared at the phone screen until the light faded to black. Swap glasses. She drugged it. This was not a prank. This was not Bianca being difficult or demanding or dramatic. This was not a plea for attention. This was an assault. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. All the times I had defended her, all the money I had funneled into her bottomless pit of debt, all the excuses I had made to my parents and myself, it all shattered in that moment. Bianca did not just want to be involved. She did not just want to be the maid of honor. She wanted to destroy me. She had waited for the highest stakes. She had waited until I was surrounded by the people whose respect I craved most, in the middle of the most expensive night of my life, to launch a chemical attack on my reputation. She wanted me to lose control. She wanted me to be the drunken, embarrassing sister so that she could be the sober, long, suffering saint. I looked at the champagne flute sitting innocently in front of me. It looked exactly as it had 10 seconds ago. Cool, crisp, deadly. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat. My instinct was to scream, to flip the table, to grab the glass and hurl it against the wall. But the training kicked in. The years of suppressing my emotions, of smoothing things over, of maintaining the facade at all costs. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I could feel Julian looking at me, sensing the shift in my energy. "Vivian," he asked softly. "Are you okay?" I turned back to him. My face felt like a mask, but I forced the muscles into a semblance of composure. "I am fine," I lied. "Just a little overwhelmed." Perfect, I thought. I need to be perfect. I looked back at the table. Bianca was busy pretending to text on her phone, purposefully ignoring me. She was waiting for the toast. She was waiting for me to drink. A cold, steely resolve settled over me, replacing the panic. It was a terrifying sensation, devoid of fear or sadness. It was the feeling of a soldier who realizes that diplomacy has failed, and the only option left is total war. I looked at the two glasses. Mine, laced with poison. Hers, filled with clean, expensive champagne. They were identical, indistinguishable, and they were sitting on a silk tablecloth. I knew what I had to do. I did not have a plan B. I did not have an exit strategy. I only had a window of opportunity and the burning, righteous anger of a woman who was finally done paying the ransom. I glanced across the room and locked eyes with Alina. She gave me a barely perceptible nod. She had seen it. She was with me. The game had changed. I was not the victim anymore. I was the player, and it was my turn to move. I sat there, staring at the two identical flutes of champagne, knowing that one of them contained my social execution. The bubbles in both glasses rose in perfect, mocking unison. To my right, Bianca was practically vibrating with anticipation, her eyes darting between my face and the glass, waiting for me to take that first, ruinous sip. She was watching me like a hawk watching a field mouse. I could not move. If I reached for the glass now, my hand might shake. If I tried to swap them while she was watching, she would see it. If I simply refused to drink, she would make a scene, loudly asking why I was not toasting my own happiness, drawing the attention of the entire room to my hesitation. I was trapped in a cage of etiquette, paralyzed by the fear of making a scene. I needed a miracle. Or, at the very least, a distraction. And then I heard it. The sound was distinct, cutting through the ambient noise of the reception like a metronome. Click. 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 It was the sound of expensive heels on hardwood. Not the scuff of a server's shoe, or the hurried step of a guest, but the measured, authoritative gait of a woman, who owned the ground she walked on. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Eleanor, Julian's mother, was approaching the head table from behind. I felt Bianca stiffen beside me. If there was one thing my sister loved more than sabotage, it was the proximity to power. And in this room, in this city, Eleanor was the sun around which all other planets orbited. She was the matriarch of the family Bianca, so desperately wanted to infiltrate. The footsteps stopped directly behind us. Bianca spun around in her chair so fast, I thought she might whip her neck. She turned her back completely to the table, to me, and to the poison, transforming instantly from a bored sister into a sycophantic admirer. "Oh, Eleanor!" Bianca gushed, her voice pitching up an octave into a tone of manufactured sweetness. "I did not see you there." I did not hesitate. In my mind, the text from Alina blazed like a neon sign. Swap glasses. My hands moved with a precision I did not know I possessed. It was not a conscious decision, it was pure survivalist instinct. I did not lift the glasses. Lifting them would catch the light. Lifting them would create movement that might be caught in someone's peripheral vision. Instead, I used the tablecloth. The table was draped in heavy, expensive silk, a fabric that was smooth and cool to the touch. I placed my fingertips on the base of my glass, the poisoned one. At the same time, I reached across the narrow gap and touched the base of Bianca's glass. "I am just admiring your gown," Bianca was saying, her hand reaching out to lightly touch Eleanor's arm, effectively locking her own body into a twisted position away from the table. "Is this Oscar de la Renta? It is absolutely stunning. The beadwork is incredible." While she spoke, I applied gentle, steady pressure. I slid the glasses. They glided across the silk like figure skaters on fresh ice. There was no sound. No scrape of crystal against wood. Just the silent, terrifying friction of glass on fabric. I pulled Bianca's clean glass toward me. I pushed my tainted glass toward her. The swap took less than 3 seconds. There was a problem. As the new glass settled in front of me, I saw it. A faint, peach-colored smudge on the rim. Bianca's lipstick. If she turned back and saw a pristine glass in front of her, and a lipstick-stained glass in front of me, she would know. The game would be up. She would scream. She would accuse me of trying to poison her, flipping the narrative before I could even take a breath. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Bianca was still talking, but she was winding down. You must tell me where you got those earrings. They are divine. I reached out with my index finger and thumb to the base of the poisoned glass now, sitting at Bianca's place setting. With a microscopic movement, I rotated it. I spun the stem until the lipstick stain I had left on the rim was facing her, positioned exactly where her own mark would have been. Then, I did the same to the glass in front of me, turning the peach smudge away from my view, hiding the evidence of the swap. Thank you, dear, Eleanor said, her voice cool and polite. She was already stepping away, extracting herself from Bianca's grasp with the practiced grace of a woman who had been dealing with social climbers for 40 years. Enjoy the evening. Bianca turned back to the table. I froze. My hands were in my lap, clenched together so tightly my knuckles were white. I forced my breathing to remain even. I forced my face to remain neutral. Bianca settled into her chair, looking flushed and triumphant. She thought she had just bonded with the matriarch. She thought she had just secured her place in the inner circle. She had no idea she had just missed the important event of the evening. She glanced at the table. The two champagne flutes sat exactly where they had been a minute ago. The golden liquid sparkled innocent under the chandeliers. The bubbles rose in lazy streams. To the naked eye, nothing had changed. She did not look closely. Why would she? She was arrogant. She was so convinced of her own cleverness. So certain that I was the oblivious victim, that it never occurred to her to check her work. She reached for the glass in front of her. The glass that I had stared at in terror only moments before. I watched her fingers close around the stem. Across the ballroom, past the dance floor and the centerpieces, I caught movement at the VIP table. Elena was holding her wine glass. She was looking directly at me. Her expression was unreadable to anyone else, but to me, it was screaming. She raised her glass an inch. A tiny, silent salute. She had seen it. The slide, the rotate, the execution. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The tension in my chest did not dissipate, but it changed flavor. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, dark anticipation. Bianca lifted the flute well, she said, turning to me with a smile that did not reach her dead, calculating eyes. Her voice was syrupy, laden with fake affection. We should toast, sister, to your big day, and to everything you deserve. I reached for my glass. The clean glass. The glass that she had been drinking from all night. I lifted it, keeping my hand steady through sheer force of will. I looked at her, really looked at her. Taking in the expensive dress I had paid for, the smug set of her mouth, the utter lack of remorse in her gaze. She was raising a glass of poison to my lips, and she was smiling about it. To family, I said softly. Bianca's smile widened. She thought I was capitulating. She thought I was playing the role of the dutiful sister one last time. To family, she agreed. We brought the glasses together. The crystal chimed, a clear, pure note that rang out like a bell tolling for the end of an era. And then, we drank. I watched the collar of my sister's throat move as she swallowed. Once. Twice. 3 times. She lowered the crystal flute with a satisfied sigh. Her lips wet with the vintage champagne that was currently delivering a cocktail of high-grade sedatives directly into her system. That is better, Bianca said, setting the glass down on the tablecloth with a little too much force. She smoothed the front of her $1,800 dress and looked at me with a smile that was all teeth. You looked so tense, Vivian. You really need to learn to relax. I took a sip from my own glass, the clean glass, and let the crisp, cold liquid wash away the phantom taste of bile in my throat. I am relaxed, I lied, my voice steady. I am just pacing myself. It is a long night. Bianca laughed, a sharp brittle sound. Oh, do not worry. I will handle the heavy lifting tonight. I have a speech prepared that is going to bring the house down. I had no doubt about that. For the next 20 minutes, time seemed to stretch and warp, becoming a slow motion study in biological warfare. The servers cleared the dessert plates. The lighting in the ballroom dimmed slightly, shifting from the warm amber of dinner service to the cooler, more intimate blue of the evening program. The master of ceremonies, a man with a baritone voice and a tuxedo that fit a little too tightly across the shoulders, stepped up to the microphone stand near the cake table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the sophisticated sound system. "If I could have your attention, please. It is time for a few words from our wedding party." I sat back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. This was the waiting game. This was the part where I had to sit perfectly still and watch the fuse burn down, praying that the explosion would happen at exactly the right moment. First up was David, Julian's best friend and a neurosurgeon with a dry wit and a complete lack of stage fright. He took the microphone and launched into a story about Julian's college days, a safe, charming anecdote involving a rowing team and a misplaced mascot. The room chuckled politely. Julian squeezed my hand, laughing at his own expense. But I was not listening to David. My entire world had narrowed down to the woman sitting on my right. I watched Bianca with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen in a petri dish. At first, there was nothing. She sat with her back straight, her chin lifted, projecting the image of the dutiful maid of honor. She checked her phone. She adjusted her earring. She took another sip of the champagne. Then, the first crack appeared. It was subtle. She blinked, hard, as if a contact lens had shifted. She reached up and rubbed her temple, a small, circular motion that betrayed a sudden onset of pressure. She shook her head slightly, just a twitch, as if trying to clear water from her ears. I leaned in, keeping my voice pitched low with concern. "Are you okay, Bianca?" She looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the confusion in her eyes. Her pupils were slightly dilated, fighting against the bright lights of the chandeliers. "I am fine," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Just a headache. It is hot in here." "It is freezing," I said gently. "Maybe you are just dehydrated. Have some more champagne. It was cruel. It was necessary." She lifted the glass again, her movements losing a fraction of their fluidity. The liquid sloshed slightly against the rim as she drank. She was treating the symptoms with the poison. David finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause. He handed the microphone back to the MC and returned to the table, clapping Julian on the shoulder. Julian stood to hug him, the two of them sharing a moment of genuine brotherhood that stood in stark contrast to the silent war happening on my side of the table. The MC beamed at the crowd. "Thank you, David. And now, we would like to invite the maid of honor to the stage." Bianca. This was it. The moment of truth. If the dose was too low, she would just be a little sleepy. She would give her speech, perhaps a bit lackluster, and then go sit down. If the dose was too high, she might pass out in her chair right now, which would be dramatic but would allow my parents to paint her as a victim of exhaustion. I needed the Goldilocks zone. I needed her functional enough to walk to the stage, but compromised enough to destroy herself once she got there. Bianca pushed her chair back. The legs of the chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made several guests turn their heads. She stood up. She swayed. It was not a stumble, yet. It was a gentle listing to the left, like a sailboat catching a sudden breeze. She caught herself, gripping the back of the chair with white, knuckled intensity. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them wide, forcing a bright, plastic smile onto her face. I held my breath. She stepped away from the table. Her steps were deliberate, heavy. She was walking like someone trying to navigate the deck of a moving ship. Clomp. Clomp. Her heels struck the floor with uneven rhythm. She made her way toward the stage area, passing the tables of Julian's extended family. I saw his Aunt Miriam frown, her eyes tracking Bianca's slightly erratic path. I saw his mother, Eleanor, stiffen in her seat, her gaze sharpening. Bianca reached the stage area. She bypassed the center microphone stand and headed straight for the wireless microphone the MC was holding. She wanted to walk around. She wanted to be dynamic. She wanted to perform. She took the microphone. Her grip was tight, her fingers wrapping around the black metal, as if it were a lifeline. She positioned herself exactly where I knew she would, right next to the $8,500 wedding cake. The cake was a towering monolith of red velvet and ivory fondant, a symbol of everything Bianca coveted, but could not afford. She stood next to it, the perfect backdrop for the photos she planned to post later. She wanted to frame herself in opulence. She wanted to look like she belonged. She raised the microphone to her lips. "Hello everyone," she said. Her voice boomed through the speakers, slightly too loud. She winced at the feedback, bringing her free hand up to cover her ear. She looked out at the sea of faces, blinking rapidly. "I am Bianca," she continued. "Vivian's sister." There was a pause. A beat of silence that stretched a little too long. She seemed to lose her train of thought, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling lights. Then, she shook her head again. A violent motion that sent a loose tendril of hair falling across her face. "I have known Vivian my whole life, obviously," she said, letting out a short, breathy laugh. "And I have to say, watching her plan this wedding has been interesting." The word came out slurred. "Interesting." This dragged out, hissing through the speakers. At the head table, Julian shifted in his seat. He leaned toward me. "Is she drunk?" he whispered. I shook my head, my eyes locked on the stage. "She only had 2 glasses of wine," I whispered back. "Maybe she is nervous." Bianca took a step forward, and her knee buckled slightly. She corrected it instantly, locking her legs straight. But the wobble was visible. She leaned back against the table that held the cake, her elbow brushing against the cascading sugar flowers. "Vivian has always been the perfect one," Bianca said, her voice turning sharp, gaining an edge of hostility that the drugs were stripping of its filter. "The one with the grades. The one with the job. And now, the one with the rich husband." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs moved through the room. This was not a wedding toast. This was an airing of grievances. But I sat still, I watched. Because I could see what the guests could not. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead. I could see the way her eyes were struggling to focus, crossing slightly as she looked at the crowd. The sedatives were hitting her central nervous system like a freight train. The melatonin was pulling a heavy, gray curtain over her consciousness. "She thinks she is better than us," Bianca announced, her words running together like melting wax. She thinks she can just leave." She trailed off. Her hand, the one holding the microphone, began to drift downward, moving away from her mouth. The sound of her breathing, heavy and ragged, filled the ballroom. "Whoa," she mumbled. The word barely audible. She looked down at her feet. She looked confused, like she had forgotten how her legs worked. She looked up at the ceiling, her expression twisting into one of childlike fear. "Why is the room moving?" she asked. It was loud. It was clear. And it was the beginning of the end. She took a step away from the cake table, trying to regain her balance, but her equilibrium was gone. Her brain was sending signals that her body was refusing to receive. Her right foot caught on the hem of her expensive silk dress. She pitched forward. It happened in slow motion. I saw her arms windmilling, trying to grab onto something. Anything to stop the fall. But there was nothing there. Just air, and the cake. She twisted as she fell, her body acting on a primal instinct to protect her face. But the momentum was too great. She slammed into the table. The table was sturdy, but the cake was top-heavy. As Bianca's body collided with the table edge, the impact sent a tremor up the structure. The 6 tiers of red velvet, destabilized by the blow, swayed dangerously. Bianca did not just hit the table. She slid. She collapsed onto the floor, her legs tangling in the tablecloth, dragging the fabric with her. And then, gravity claimed its prize. The cake ticked. The $8,500 tower of sugar and status leaned, surrendered, and fell. It did not fall onto the floor. It fell onto her. There was a sound that I will never forget. A wet, heavy thud, followed by the shattering of the crystal cake stand. The 6 tiers exploded on impact, disintegrating into a chaos of crimson crumbs and ivory cream. The room went dead silent. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The scene looked like a massacre. The red velvet cake, dark and vivid, was smeared across the white floor and across Bianca's champagne dress, looking disturbingly like blood. She lay motionless in the center of the ruin, half buried under 5 layers of cake, her platinum blonde hair matted with frosting and gold leaf. Then, the screaming started. My mother's voice cut through the silence, a shrill, piercing shriek. Bianca. Julian was already moving. He was a doctor before he was a groom. And his training kicked in faster than anyone else's shock. He vaulted over the head table, ignoring the gasp of the crowd, and sprinted toward the stage. I stood up slowly. I did not run. I did not scream. I smoothed the skirt of my wedding dress and walked around the table, following in my husband's wake. I needed to be close. I needed to see it. I needed to be sure that the destruction was total. As I approached the stage, the smell hit me. Sugar. Vanilla. And the metallic tang of fear from the crowd. Julian was on his knees beside the wreckage, his hands moving fast, checking for a pulse, checking her airway. He shoved a chunk of red velvet cake aside to clear her face. Bianca's eyes fluttered open. She was dazed, covered in frosting, looking like the victim of a cartoon explosion, brought to horrifying life. She looked up at Julian, her eyes rolling in her head, unable to focus on his face. The microphone was still in her hand. She had gripped it tight as she fell, and now it was lying on her chest, right beneath her chin, live and transmitting. She groaned. A low, guttural sound that echoed from every speaker in the room. She tried to lift her head, but the drugs were pinning her to the floor. She licked her lips, tasting the frosting, confusion washing over her features. Then, she spoke. It was a whisper, but the microphone caught it perfectly. It amplified the slur, the confusion, and the damning, undeniable truth. Wrong glass, she mumbled, her voice thick. It was the wrong glass. I stopped walking. I stood 10 feet away, watching my husband freeze. I saw his head snap up. I saw the realization dawn on his face. The room heard it. 300 people heard it. The drugged glass? She clarified, her eyes closing as consciousness finally slipped away. Why did I drink the drug glass? The confession hung in the air, heavier than the humidity, sweeter than the cake, and sharper than a guillotine blade. It was over. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a verdict being read. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden collision of luxury and catastrophe. The only sound was the high, pitched feedback whine of the wireless microphone, which was still resting against my sister's frosting, smeared chest. Julian moved first. He reached down and snatched the microphone away, his movements sharp and decisive. He clicked it off, severing the connection that had just broadcast Bianca's confession to 300 stunned witnesses. He handed the device to a frozen waiter without looking at him. His attention entirely focused on the woman lying in the wreckage of the wedding cake. I walked closer, stopping at the edge of the stage. The devastation was total. The red velvet cake had exploded with the force of a bomb. Chunks of dark crimson sponge were scattered across the white dance floor, mixed with shards of the sugar flowers I had paid extra for. The creamy ivory frosting was smeared everywhere, creating a visual that was disturbingly visceral. In the dim light, it looked less like a bakery mishap and more like a crime scene. Julian was checking her vitals. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, counting the beats. He used his thumb to peel back her eyelid, exposing the white of her eye. "Is she breathing?" I asked. My voice was calm. Too calm. "She is breathing," Julian said, his voice flat and clinical. "But her respiration is depressed. Her pulse is thready." My parents hit the stage like a hurricane. My mother, blithe, scrambled up the steps in her silver-beaded gown, ignoring the cake debris that immediately ruined her shoes. She threw herself down beside Bianca, nearly knocking Julian over. "Get away from her!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "What did you do to her?" "She is sick! My baby is sick!" My father, Conrad, was right behind her. His face was a mask of red fury, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at me, then at Julian, desperate for someone to blame for the humiliation unfolding in front of the city's elite. "This is the heat," he bellowed, addressing the room at large, trying to spin a narrative that was already dead. "She has been working too hard. She is exhausted. It is just heat stroke." Julian stood up. He rose to his full height, smoothing the front of his tuxedo jacket, which was now speckled with red crumbs. He looked at my father, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of his lineage in his expression. It was a cold, aristocratic disdain that could freeze water. "It is not heatstroke, Conrad," Julian said. The volume of his voice was conversational, yet it carried to the back of the room. My father sputtered. "You are a bone doctor, not a specialist." "You do not know what." "I am a physician," Julian interrupted, cutting him off with surgical precision. "And I know what a sedative overdose looks like." The words hung in the air. My mother stopped wailing and looked up, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. "That is a lie," she hissed. "Bianca would never take drugs. She is a fitness influencer. She treats her body like a temple." Julian pointed down at Bianca, who was now snoring softly, a deep, rattling sound that indicated her airway was relaxing a little too much. "She has pinpoint pupils," Julian listed, ticking the symptoms off on his fingers. "She has severe ataxia. She is slurring her speech. And she just admitted, on a live microphone, to drinking a glass she believed was drugged." He paused, letting the evidence sink in. "This is synergistic toxicity," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "She mixed alcohol with a central nervous system depressant, likely benzodiazepines or a high dose of synthetic sleep aids. She is not tired, Blythe. She is stoned." My mother gasped, clutching Bianca's hand to her chest. "How dare you? How dare you say that about your own sister-in-law on her wedding day?" "She tried to poison Vivian," Julian said. He did not shout it. He stated it as a fact, as undeniable as gravity. He looked at my parents, his eyes hard. "She tried to drug my wife. She intended for Vivian to drink that glass. She intended for Vivian to be the one collapsing on this stage, humiliating herself in front of my family. But she made a mistake. And now she is suffering the consequences of her own malice." My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate. "Now you listen here, son. This is a family matter. We will handle this. We are going to take her to the hotel room and—" "No," Julian said. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. "I have already called 911. The ambulance is 2 minutes away." "You called an ambulance?" my father shouted. "For a little fainting spell. You are blowing this out of proportion? Think of the scandal. Think of what people will say." "I think," Julian said, tapping the screen of his phone, "that people will say she is lucky I am calling an ambulance instead of the police." My father froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, waxen gray. "Attempted poisoning is a felony," Julian said softly. "And we have 300 witnesses who heard her confession." The sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every second, cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. The sound seemed to puncture my father's bluster. He looked at the guests who were watching in rapt silence. He looked at the ruined cake. He looked at me. "Vivian," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a wheedle. Tell him to call it off. This is your sister. She made a mistake. A silly mistake. You cannot let them take her away like a criminal." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had forced me to give up my scholarship. The man who had made me pay for Bianca's mistakes for a decade. The man who was currently standing in the wreckage of my wedding cake, worried about his own reputation while his daughter lay unconscious from a drug overdose she had engineered for me. I stepped forward. The movement drew his eyes. "She is not going to the hotel," I said. My voice surprised me. It was not the voice of the dutiful daughter. It was the voice of a stranger. A strong stranger. "She is going to the hospital, and you are going with her." "Vivian!" my mother cried. "You are heartless?" The double doors of the ballroom burst open. 4 paramedics in navy blue uniforms rushed in, pushing a gurney. They moved with a chaotic urgency that clashed with the formal elegance of the room. "Over here," Julian called out, waving them down. The paramedics swarmed the stage. They pushed my parents aside with professional indifference. They checked Bianca's vitals, shouted numbers to each other, and lifted her limp body onto the stretcher. Her head lolled to the side, frosting smearing onto the clean white sheets of the gurney. One of the paramedics looked at my mother. "Are you the family?" "Yes!" my mother sobbed. "I am her mother." "You can ride in the back," the paramedic said. "Let's move." They wheeled Bianca away. My mother scrambled after them, clutching her purse. My father lingered for a second longer. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. He opened his mouth to say something. Perhaps a final guilt trip, perhaps a curse, but Julian took a step forward, placing himself physically between us. "Go," Julian ordered. My father turned and ran after the gurney. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in their wake. The show was over. The villains had exited stage left. I stood there, looking at the mess. The smell of sugar was overwhelming now, cloying and sweet. The floor was a disaster zone of red crumbs and white cream. My beautiful, expensive reception was in shambles. The hotel manager, a man named Mr. Henderson who looked like he was about to have a stroke, materialized at my elbow. He was wringing his hands, his face pale with professional mortification. "Mrs. Ashford," he stammered. "I am so terribly sorry. We will begin clearing the room immediately. I can have the valet bring the guests' cars around. We can shut down the bar. I assume you want to end the event." I looked at him. Then I looked at the crowd. The guests were frozen. Uncertain of the protocol for a wedding that had turned into a medical emergency. They were holding their drinks, whispering behind their hands, watching me with wide, pitying eyes. They expected me to crumble. They expected the weeping bride, the ruined night, the tragic end. I looked down at the cake. $8,500. It was a pile of trash. And yet, as I looked at it, I felt something bubbling up in my chest. It was not hysteria. It was not grief. It was relief. It was a relief so profound, so absolute, that it felt like weightlessness. The tension that I had carried in my shoulders for 3 months, for 10 years, snapped. The monster was gone. The threat had been neutralized. The worst thing that could possibly happen had happened, and I was still standing. I was safe. I looked at Julian. He was watching me, his eyes filled with concern, waiting for me to break. I smiled. It was a real smile. The first real smile I had worn all day. "No," I said to the manager. He blinked. "I beg your pardon." I turned to the bandleader, who was standing awkwardly by the drum kit, holding his saxophone like a weapon. "Is the band paid until midnight?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "Then play," I said. I turned back to the manager. "Get a cleanup crew to mop this up. It does not have to be perfect, just get the big chunks." Then go to the kitchen and bring out whatever dessert you have in the back. Cookies. Brownies. Ice cream. I do not care. And open another case of champagne. But, Mrs. Ashford, the manager stuttered. The cake, the ambulance, The trash has been taken out, Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice ringing clear and strong. The night has only just begun. I walked over to Julian. I took his hand, which was still sticky with frosting residue. I did not care. I pulled him toward the center of the dance floor, away from the stage, away from the ruin. He looked at me, searching my face for signs of shock. Vivian. Are you sure? I wrapped my arms around his neck. I pressed my body against his, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of him. I looked over his shoulder at the empty doors, where my family had vanished, and I felt a sense of freedom that was more intoxicating than the wine. Dance with me, Julian, I whispered. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then he smiled. He signaled the band. The drummer counted off, 4 sharp clicks of his sticks, and the band launched into an upbeat, swinging jazz number. Julian spun me around. My dress flared out. The guests, taking their cue from the bride, began to clap. The tension broke. The pity evaporated, replaced by a sudden, electric energy. I danced on the edge of the disaster. I danced while the hotel staff swept up the red velvet wreckage. I danced while the sirens faded into the distance. I danced on the grave of my old life. For the first time in 29 years, I did not miss a step. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from the room. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains of the hotel suite, painting the duvet in stripes of gold and white. For a moment, lying there in the stillness, I forgot. Then, the memory of the red velvet explosion rushed back, not as a nightmare, but as a vivid, satisfying movie reel. I rolled over. Julian was still asleep, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown carelessly over his eyes. He looked younger in the morning light, the lines of stress from the hospital and the wedding planning smoothed away. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I knew it was coming. It was as inevitable as the tide. There it was. A text message from my mother, sent at 3 a.m. The message read, "How could you let them take her?" She woke up terrified. "The doctors say it was an overdose. This is your fault. You put too much pressure on her. You need to come to the hospital immediately and fix this. Bring money for the bill." Family is family, Vivian. I stared at the words. The old Vivian, the one who existed before the glass swap, would have felt the familiar claw of guilt in her gut. She would have already been out of bed, pulling on jeans, calculating how much was in her savings account to cover the emergency room copay. She would have been drafting an apology for a crime she did not commit. But that Vivian was gone. She had dissolved in a glass of champagne. I looked at the phone. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel obligation. I felt nothing but a cool, detached clarity. I did not type a response. I did not try to explain that Bianca had poisoned herself. I did not argue. I simply tapped the information icon. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen. I pressed block caller. Then, I did the same for my father. And finally, for Bianca. I set the phone back on the nightstand, face down. The tether was cut. The anchor was gone. I lay back against the pillows and closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the ocean outside, breathing in the air of a life that finally belonged to me. 1 year later, the nursery was painted a soft, calming sage green. I sat in the rocking chair, one hand resting on the swell of my stomach, feeling the strong, rhythmic kick of my daughter. She was due in 3 weeks. Julian walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He set them down on the small side table and knelt beside the chair, resting his cheek against my belly. "She is active tonight," he murmured, smiling as a small foot pressed against his face. "We have to make a promise," I said quietly. He looked up, his eyes serious. "I know. No favorites," I said. "No golden child. No scapegoat. She never has to earn her place in this house. She just has to exist. We broke the cycle, Julian said, kissing my hand. It stops with us. I looked out the window at the oak trees swaying in the twilight. My phone sat on the dresser across the room. It had been silent for a year. My mother had tried to reach out through aunts and cousins, sending messages about wanting to make amends, about wanting to know her grandchild. I had never responded. Some bridges, once burned, should remain ashes. I thought about the wedding cake. I thought about the 6 tiers of red velvet, the gold leaf, the sugar flowers. $8,500. It was an obscene amount of money for a dessert. For a long time, the number had stung. But sitting here now, in the quiet safety of my own home, free from the drama, the debts, and the manipulation, I realized the truth. It wasn't a waste. It was a bargain. $8,500 was the exit fee. It was the ransom payment for my freedom. It was the cost of revealing the monster. So clearly that I could finally, guiltlessly, walk away. I took a sip of tea and smiled into the darkness. It was the best money I ever spent.